All right, we're going to go ahead and get started, even though we know that Aaron Mark will have food here shortly for you all. Let me just. My name is Dr. Hudson, and today we'll be having a conversation around Indigenous land acknowledgments, respecting and honoring Indigenous peoples and histories as part of our social change leadership series and a celebration of Indigenous Peoples Month in the month of November. To start off, I am not an expert in Indigenous peoples here in South Texas. The point of this is to spark a conversation as it relates to what is a land acknowledgement. So if you go to a conference, you'll end up seeing people issue a land acknowledgement. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is it. We're also going to talk a little bit about some of the first peoples that are native to South Texas. And so we're going to look a little bit, but it's going to be very limited from me. And it's actually going to be themselves through video talking a little bit about their peoples and their connection to South Texas. So anytime we're having conversations around different ethnic groups, indigenous groups, racial groups, religious groups, it's important to have conversations and a firm understanding of what is or is not power, especially in something as I would say as sensitive as talking around indigenous peoples and really the ethnic cleansing that took place in the United States amongst multiple levels, is understanding that there is an inherent power structure that has existed, and power for our purposes is the ability, we're defining it as the ability or the official authority to decide what is best for others. And so when we could think about Indigenous peoples, it was the forcible removal of these individuals from their own land or placement into schools, things of that nature. Ability to decide who has access to resources, and so the removal of Indigenous peoples from their sacred lands or the lands that they've known for generations to other things. And I'm not going to fully get into all of that, but it's really, I think, this ability of to determine the capacity and exercise control over others. And I think that really plays true, especially here in this context. Privilege, right, is unearned access to resources only readily available to some groups as a result of their advantage social group membership. And when we're talking about Indigenous folks, we're talking about the privilege that we ourselves have as standing on someone else's native lands, right? So this was land taken away from other individuals, land forcibly removed from peoples that have been here longer than we have ourselves. And so then what does this create? A system of oppression that maintains advantage with some individuals and disadvantage for others, and based off of social group membership, right? So if you are an Indigenous people or you're part of a native, maybe a tribal organization or a tribe itself, through lineage, you are placed at a disadvantage in the United States, and specifically even here in Texas as well, that's home to many different Indigenous groups. So, and this can happen both at an individual level, can happen at an institutional or cultural level. And we're going to look more at the institutional level, right? About how did the native folks from South Texas, looking at the Rio Grande all the way kind of up here, and we're doing some broad strokes, broad painting when we talk about these organizations, not organizations, but these tribes and these Indigenous folks. I'm going to look at some of the institutional areas. So really what I wanted to start off with was, what is it at land acknowledgement? Has anyone actually ever seen a land acknowledgement in person? Witnessed it in person? Do we know what it is? Does anyone want to start off by saying, what is the land acknowledgement? Yes.
I'm guessing it's more like what's it called, where people gather. I mean, sure, where people gather or
okay, so maybe advocating against the destruction of land, like, okay. Anyone else want to take a stab at it or a guess at it? Well, a land acknowledgement is a formal statement that an individual or a organization or an institution issues that recognizes and respects the Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. So you'll see this often at academic conferences, at institutions of higher education. In fact, University of Texas has their own land acknowledgement and acknowledging of the traditional peoples of the Austin area on their website, right? So you'll see institutions, organizations, individuals really begin to acknowledge, hey, we are on someone else's land, right? We are privileged to be able to stand here today that on land that was actually settled by someone else, and an acknowledgement that colonialism has existed in the United States and elsewhere in the forcible removal of individuals from their land. Why do we recognize the land, right? And I think I'm going to let you all read this, but to recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring and acknowledging and respecting those who have been living and working on this land, on the land from time immemorial. Meaning they've been here for a very long time, and we need to respect and honor the traditions, the culture that they themselves were in many ways robbed and forcibly removed and experienced on some levels ethnic cleansing throughout that. So it's important to understand the long-standing history, and especially down here where it's very difficult at times to kind of determine the indigenous populations because they were migratory in some levels. Last year, we did one of these with the Kickapoo tribe. We had a conversation with them. They came up and talked about their peoples. And so here we're speaking about other kind of larger aspects. They do not exist in the past tense, land acknowledgements, right? But they do, as it says here, it is important to understand the long-standing history that is brought to us by residing on this land and to seek to understand our own place within this history, right? This land in and of itself was given by the Killams, right? The Killams still own tons of property all around us. Well, how did the Killams get that land? The Killams themselves own a lot of land in the city of Laredo, right? How did they come to get this land? How did the people before them get the land, right? So there's acknowledging that there's some historical context that is there because it is an ongoing process. Colonialism and the indigenous peoples in the United States were definitely on the receiving end of a lot of that colonialism that we have here. So it's all about mindful participation in the present. And it is part of indigenous protocols. And so you'll often see tribal leaders leading these land acknowledgements at conferences, at different professional associations, things of that nature, as a way to draw connections to the folks that really were there already. So I'm going to let you all see a video from an indigenous perspective related to this.
Before I begin this morning, I'd like to recognize the Algonquin Nation, on whose traditional territory we are gathering. We acknowledge them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land.
Wherever I go on God's green earth, I do the Lakota tradition of acknowledging the four directions, the land, and the people living there. Unchimaka, as I call Grandmother Earth, the land, I view her as a sacred, living entity, and that's the way we acknowledge it in, Lakota thought and philosophy.
As a Native person, I'm ready for any kind of confrontation that might come up, or I'm preparing myself to remind people of all those things that they forget about. I was at a meeting in Minneapolis, and the room was primarily non-Native people. I was in a non-Native organization, but this executive director got up and said, okay, we're gonna get started. So everybody, was sitting down and getting quiet. And she said, I'd like to get started by acknowledging the indigenous culture of Minnesota. And I was like, first, I was like, whoa. And it just made everything like fall away a little bit from me. My guard went down. I was more relaxed because by saying that, like, that means she understands something that is just like you can't talk about, right? It just relaxed me as a minority, as a woman, and as a Native person. Like it just like pulled away this layer that's always there, you know? It was super cool.
We're at a time where non-Native cultures are understanding the traditions of Indigenous peoples for probably the first time in our histories. So like when I go to New Zealand, the protocol is to acknowledge each other's ancestors and your mountains and your rivers. And that's such a beautiful tradition. When people are in that space and say, we acknowledge who you are, this land, where your people come from, they're saying we acknowledge a relationship, but we're also creating that relationship. This is a good thing.
The important thing would be that folks would then sit with that. Like, what does it mean that our settlement is occupying this space? And what responsibility do I have considering that legacy to these contemporary things, right? And how do I stop distancing myself from that? Ideally, that would be, for me, the impact that this has.
If you start acknowledging that the land that you're standing on and the space that you are in belong to people that are still here, like, makes so much more room for understanding of all these other issues. It's one of those little things that, like, if it could just tip a little bit, all the like dominoes that could fall from it, I think are important.
Now I'm like imagining it and like wanting to live in that, like the thing that I'm imagining, like, yeah, that's actually really beautiful.
It's just being a genuine human being to acknowledge each other's histories, the good and the bad.
So we're gonna, before we move into the next video here, I think it's just is a very interesting thought process, right? About this reconciliation process. Truth and reconciliation is actually a very unique thing that has happened in a lot of countries where in many ways either apartheid or ethnic cleansing is taking place, including in South Africa and in Canada. And so you begin to see a lot of conciliatory or reconciliatory programs that have taken place inside of these governments and institutional. And I think that it oftentimes here in Laredo, because the majority of us are Hispanic Latino, don't fully recognize the unique role that maybe our ancestors did play in the settling of this land and or the taking of this land comparatively to others. So what we're going to do here, we're going to take a little break on the video so you all can go get food, and then we'll be able to come back here. So we're going to take a little break while people go get food, and then if you have, we'll start right back up here shortly. And so today it's a Indian this is the Well, it looks like a majority of you are there. I'm going to go ahead and continue to play the video.
There are Dell Edge devices that scale up conservation at a level that had never been seen before.
Having solutions that can overcome that challenge of scale and just really enable actual meaningful conservation work.
I'm here today as a guest on land that was stolen from the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations. Land that many other tribal nations thought of as home before those relationships were written over by settler colonialism. So land acknowledgments like this have become pretty commonplace at the beginning of events, at universities, sometimes in our email signatures. But I've always found them to be kind of confusing. Like, once you admit something is stolen, aren't you supposed to give it back? So if there's anyone listening who has a couple hundred spare acres that you're feeling guilty about, just contact your local tribal government. We would be happy to relieve you of that burden. That's probably not you, right? Maybe you've heard of this movement to return land to Indigenous people, but you're thinking, I can barely afford rent. What is it I'm supposed to be giving back? That's what I want to clarify today. Because not only is getting land back in Indigenous hands in your best interests, and the best interests of the land itself, there's ways anyone can help make it happen. I'm a descendant of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians, which is part of the Anishinaabe Nation of the Great Lakes region. Home, for me, is also the Pacific Northwest. I grew up on Kalapuya and Molalla territory, and now I'm a professor of Indigenous Studies at CSU. My ancestors worked very hard to navigate a complex and changing world that was ravaged by settler colonialism. My grandma and both of her parents survived the trauma and abuse of the Indian boarding school system. The generation before them fought to keep our tribe from being terminated by the federal government. Going even further back, my 6 times great-grandfather's signature is on the 1863 Treaty of Old Crossing, which forced the Anishinaabe to give up 11 million acres of what's now Minnesota in exchange for a little over $400,000 and a 640-acre reservation. That works out to about 5 cents an acre, which has to be one of the worst land deals in US history. Or maybe the best, depending on who you ask. This sort of thing happened all over the US and Canada. And the problem isn't just that settlers showed up and took the land, it's how they've treated it ever since. That land we lost in Minnesota, the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline goes right through the middle of it. That freaking pipeline is responsible for the largest inland oil spill ever recorded in the US. And now, they're trying to expand it. Whether we're talking pipelines or some other industry, the colonial mindset has been about extracting resources, mostly with the goal of making the rich richer. But that's why land back is not about Indigenous people trying to run a real estate scam. We're doing this because the land itself is in crisis. Every Indigenous culture is unique, but our shared philosophy is that we come from the land and the land is what sustains us. And therefore, we have a responsibility to care for it. Land back is about reasserting Indigenous relationships.
Tourists, Tourists that turn into scientists. Tourists taking photos that are analyzed by AI. So researchers can help life underwater flourish.
With the land. Relationships that are based on tens of thousands of years of hands-on experience taking care of our homelands. If you've ever tried your hand at farming or gardening, you know that land management takes more than just showing up with good intentions. Globally, Indigenous people are really good at managing for biodiversity and resilient ecosystems. That's because we've had generation upon generation to test out what works and what doesn't. There's tons of evidence and examples to back this up. One recent study showed that Indigenous people make up just 5% of the global population, but we're managing nearly half the areas on Earth that are protected for conservation or still support intact ecosystems. In the United States, tribal nations have reintroduced endangered species, even when the government said it wouldn't work. So in the Northwest, where I grew up, most of the big rivers have been dammed, which makes it super hard for salmon to survive, and many runs have gone extinct. So back in the 90s, the Nimipu people told the state of Idaho, hey, we'd like to bring coho salmon back to the Snake River. The state fish and wildlife guys were like, I don't think so. But the tribe did it anyway. They got eggs that one of the hatcheries was gonna throw away, incubated them, and basically snuck the fish back into the river. And now they're doing so well that the state has reopened the sport fishery, and the tribe is reintroducing coho to a bunch of other rivers. Same thing with buffalo. Back in the 1800s, when the railroads were going in and Native people were literally being kicked off the land at gunpoint, buffalo were nearly exterminated because they thought that would make it easier to subdue the tribes who depended on them. So get this, most of the buffalo that you see today in zoos or wildlife reserves are actually descended from conservation herds that Native people protected back then. And now, the Blackfeet Nation is bringing free-ranging buffalo back to their homeland in Montana. We're also pretty good at cleaning up the ecological messes caused by colonialism. The town of Eureka, California was like, okay, we're ready to give some land back. We know it's culturally a really important place to you. Oh, and by the way, it's a Superfund site, so it's hella polluted. Good luck with that. And the Wyatt tribe said, great, we'll take it. And now they're in the process of successfully remediating the site. They've removed tons of trash and contaminated soil. They're working on erosion control and wildlife habitat and making it a place where they can hold ceremonies again. The land is better off in Indigenous hands because we treat the land like it's a relative. Even our youth know how this works. So I run a summer camp for Native kids where we talk about Indigenous science and how we relate to the land. So last summer, after the camp wraps up, Henry's mom calls me. He's one of the campers, he's 6. And she says he's had a falling out with his best friend. They were playing outside and the friend, who's not Native, was squishing grasshoppers for fun. Henry tried to stop him and the friend said, they're just bugs, it doesn't matter. But Henry told him, they're not just bugs, they're our relatives, and you can't kill them. So that was the summer I had to learn how to keep grasshoppers from eating my garden with garlic spray, because every time I went to use pesticides or something that would kill them, I thought of Henry and what kind of future we might have if we actually lived like that. Land Back is about radically rethinking how we relate to the land and other living beings. So look up whose land you're on. Some tribes, like the Ohlone and Duwamish, have a way for you to pay a voluntary land tax on their website as a way to recognize that you're a guest on their homeland. Way easier than dealing with the IRS. Or maybe you do own land, but you need to live there for now. You can set up a bequest in your will so that your estate goes back to the tribe. I'm not saying that any of this is easy. Unsettling is hard work, especially in places where Indigenous people were removed or erased. That absence tends to be papered over with the myth that colonialism worked, Native people disappeared, so there's nothing to worry about. But when I look at my own family's history, the government that took our land and outlawed our ceremonies, the boarding schools that took our language, the epidemic of sexual violence that has touched nearly every Native woman in my family. All of these concerted efforts to end the story of us as Anishinaabe people. And yet, despite all that, we're still here. Our survival as Indigenous people is a miracle. And the point of miracles is that they inspire action. I think if we're honest as human beings, we know that this path we're on is both morally untenable and ecologically unsustainable. Land back is a call to action. To get real that the current system is only really working for an increasingly smaller group of folks. But when the people who are benefiting from this legacy of stolen land step forward, real change can happen. This isn't just an opportunity to right a past injustice, it's the only way to heal the land itself. And that means a better future for everyone. Thank you.
So, it's an interesting thought process, but I think if we can acknowledge the unique role that the land that we are on, situated on, and acknowledge those that have come before us, we're actually able to recognize a lot of the truth in what she said, and a lot of the truth that we continue to see happening here. So we're going to shift topics a little bit around the land acknowledgements to talk now about whose land are we actually on right now. So, does anyone know some of the indigenous tribes located here in South Texas? Anyone? Is this taught in your schools? No? Interesting. I am from Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, we have the Ho-Chunk people. And the Ho-Chunk people, there were a small band tribe of them. I'm from Beloit, Wisconsin, which is home to Beloit College. And Beloit College is a small liberal arts college, but on their campus, they have, and throughout my area that I lived in, was a small band of the Turtle tribe that was part of the larger group of the Ho-Chunk people. And on our college campus that I could walk across often as it was my way to get to the bus stop that I had to go to middle school, amongst other things, we would walk on their Indian mounds. So these were mounds that they would bury their ancestors and relatives in. And everything around us in Wisconsin was very much connected to the indigenous people. So it's so interesting that we in Wisconsin have a very large connection to our indigenous people. And yet here in Texas, especially here in Laredo, when a majority of our Latino individuals have some form of indigenous ancestry, we begin to see we don't even know whose land this is. So here's a generic map, right? A generic map of the state of Texas and some of the indigenous population tribes that we have here. This is not exclusive. It is very much a kind of, I would say, a broad viewpoint. I am, again, not an expert in indigenous peoples of South Texas, of any indigenous peoples, but I'm bringing awareness as it relates to our necessity to acknowledge the land and the peoples, respecting and honoring their histories and what they brought to us. So here is kind of where we're at, right? We're here on the area, it's the Coanteco and the Carrizo Comecrudo tribes. It does not say Comecrudo tribe there, but we're going to learn today about the Coanteco and Carrizo tribe springs. So the Coahuiltecans, I have a hard time even saying that. Coahuiltecans are a broad umbrella for a lot of the people here in South Texas. We're talking all the way up to Austin. And we're going to watch them themselves, Coahuiltecans, talk about from Texas State University. They actually have a very larger connection to them. But these South Texas plains were originally occupied and had at least written history in the 16th century. Not saying that they were originally occupied, but at least the first form of written history was located in the 16th century, and hundreds of small, highly mobile groups of hunters and gatherers ranged across southern Texas and northeastern Mexico. So really from, I believe it goes all the way up to past Eagle Pass, up a little bit further, all the way over to the Gulf of Mexico. And in these areas, when the Spanish first came here and began to settle, right, the Spaniards from Spain began to colonize and settle here. They called these indigenous people naciones or tribes, and they looked collectively at these different groups, the Coahuiltecans, which consisted of folks that had different languages in different areas of the location. So the Comecrudos, the Cotonames, Aranamas, the Solanos, the Sanan, as well as the Carrizo, the Puquauch, the Pastaloca, and the Pitalac individuals. These are folks that are here. And I'm not going to go fully into it, but understand that these individuals for both the Coahuiltecan as well as the Carrizo Comecrudo tribes themselves have a longstanding history here in this area. They were hunters and gatherers, relying primarily on the nopals, as well as papayas, etc. So again, so this is the Coahuiltecan people that still exist. You can go see them up in San Antonio, down here as well. And the Carrizos, Comecrudos, of which you can go down to there, primarily down right now located in the Rio Grande Valley. And you're going to see Juan Macias in a bit on a most recent NPR, or excuse me, no, PBS special out of Michigan. He was just talking about their fight related to the river and protecting the river, as their people have had a historic connection to, as do many indigenous groups, have a connection to the river and their fight against Customs and Border Patrol and the state of Texas with the recent placement of barbed wire and other razor fencing inside of the Rio Grande and Eagle Pass, as well as the, as we saw there, the exploitation of the land down in the Rio Grande Valley as it relates to oil extraction throughout South Texas, including all the way up to Corpus. And you'll begin to see a little bit about that. So I think it's important for us to at least talk a little bit or learn a little bit about the Coahuiltecan, who are the first people of Texas.
My name is Jacob Andrew Aguilar. Like, I'm 18 years old.
You want to put that bag back here?
We're going to like some place where our ancestors lived and everything, and they painted something called the White Shaman. It's a cave painting of how they lived, what they did, and everything.
I'm Mario Garza from one of the Coahuiltecan tribes from Texas. It's important to show Jacob the White Shaman panel because it documents our existence by documenting our creation story.
When I was little, like 5 years old, my dad told me we have some Native American blood. He found out we were actually Coahuiltecan. I wish to be more informative of my culture.
The White Shaman panel has been carbon dated to be over 4,000 years. To go to the actual panel, we have to hike along the edge of the canyon. The hike is going to be a little rough. The total trip going there and back, it's 1.7 miles. And it's not an easy hike.
That's for the snakes. Every so often we need to do that until the snakes will come in.
You hear the vibration, you feel the vibration.
My name is Gary Perez, and I am the Sacred Sites Director for Indigenous Cultures Institute in San Marcos. When our ancestors were out here, okay, when the Spanish arrived in Texas, they were hunter-gatherers. This is a sotol plant, and what our ancestors did with it was they made floor mats out of them and sandals. The rock art that we're looking at right now is what's commonly known out here as monochrome. It's got one color, one red color all the way across.
This was our ancestors' type of writing. They're telling a story. The story of creation is the story of the underworld.
Of the rock art around here, we consider this the most important to us because it shows our creation story as we have been told for hundreds of years, thousands of years. You cannot read this going from left to right or right to left or top to bottom or whatever. You have to see it more in a global form. Here in the middle, you see that white figure, and they call that the white shaman, and that's what gave this panel the name. But he lost his head, and that became the moon. And this figure represents to us Mother Earth.
It's a way of preserving our culture and showing how we lived, what we did, and who we are.
Now, the story begins a little further back from the creation of our people. There's the creation of the universe. And what happened is, one day, the cold, dark, wet sun went into the underworld and then rode the deer through the underworld. And then the full moon rose and acted on Mother Earth's body, and Mother Earth's water broke, and we were born from these springs. This is the constellation of Taurus, okay? And what happens is this comet, every 548 years, this comet will fly. But in 2018, that comet is gonna fly through Taurus at midnight, at the time that the moon is full and at the time that we are born.
So it's almost like a calendar, right?
It's a calendar.
It is a calendar.
It's a calendar.
It's a calendar.
Tells you where to be, what to see, also what to sing, what to say, everything. You can live your life entirely by this calendar, son.
When I come here, I feel, that it's alive, that it's still telling us a lot of things. And we have been able to study and interpret some parts of it, but every time I look at it, we notice new things. It has been said that we did not have a written language, but I mean, the proof is right there. And we lost it for a lot of times, but we're able to interpret the rock art, and we pray in our language.
Preserving culture is a big part of humanity and everything. The more cultures that we know about, the more we know about how, as humans, how our ancestors lived, what they did, and where we come from.
So what we're going to do now is, so it's learning a little bit about the Huiltecan group. We're not going to watch a 50-minute, but I need to get to present. We are going to watch some of this recent PBS special as it relates to Indigenous land. Acknowledgments, but talk specifically about the Carrizo or Macrudo tribe here in South Texas, which is, in fact, a lot of members are here in Laredo. So this is actually very specific to Laredo, Rio Bravo, and Zapata, all the way down to there, to the valley. So Brownsville, all the way up to about Laredo, historically. So
we call ourselves the Eshtokna, which means the human persons. And as you go up and down this river, you'll find that we had connections all the way to the only one place that was sedentary along the river. It was called Punta del Sur. And that's where Devil's River and up in this area, where Devil's River and the Pecos and also the Rio Grande, where they flow into the Rio Grande. So now, with all the extractive stuff that is happening out there, fossil fuels, we got three major
who is the
oil deposits or petroleum deposits. One is the Permian Basin, and the other one is the Fort
October 3rd, 2020
Shale, which is further toward San Antonio and runs right by Houston in between those two places. And then we have the Barden deposits up in East Texas. So you have a lot of extraction going on in Texas where they completely voided everything that was there because they've waived a lot of the laws, and some of these companies, the fossil fuel companies, go in there and they say, we're going to build an intrastate pipeline, and all they got to do is get a permit from the Texas Railroad Commission. And there's no IESs, no EASs, no 106 forms that are filled out, no historical thing that is done. So they continue to do this without permission of the public and the people living in private lands, and they quote that they can do it by eminent domain. At least Texas does. But I think they can't do that. It's got to be something that the federal government has to give permission to, but they're not getting those permits. And these EISs and EASs, to me, are very important because they actually have an environmental impact study, an assessment study that makes them do the history behind all of what's going on here. And these are all—
Juan,
yes.
Sorry, can you tell us what is the EIS for those that maybe don't know what that is in the public?
EIS is an environmental impact study, and EAS is an environmental assessment study, and they all have to do with all of this that's going on. And with the wall, when they started putting up the wall in 2005, they waived 26 laws. Now they're up to 48 laws that they've waived. And two of them were directed mainly to the Native American communities. And that means all across, not the
You can even see it up in the top left corner.
And that was the NACPRA, which is the Native American Grace Protection and Repatriation Act, and also the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. So they were directed right at the Native people again, trying to void out and make them like they didn't exist. And so that's
Can I interject really quick? And Juan, and maybe this can take us to kind of the next theme that I wanted to touch upon, and it's the way that we actually met Juan. And we met Juan when he came to Los Angeles to a community center that doesn't exist anymore in East LA on Boyle Heights neighborhood called La Concha, run by a group of feminist women, Latinx women. And I had the opportunity and the blessing really to attend this talk where Juan, together with other members of the tribe, were sharing with the community the protection that they were embodying against the border wall construction along the Rio Grande Valley at that moment. And that must have been 2018, if I'm not wrong. We had already conducted a number of visits with David to Somisec, but we didn't know about the Carrizo Comecrudo tribe or about the protection and the actions and the direct actions that were taking place along the border wall. And in this talk, Juan explained and shared how they were claiming the land and liberating the land, or at least that's how we call it in Latin America, liberaciones de la madre tierra, by holding the ground where ancestral villages of the Carrizo have been along the border, along the Rio Grande, sorry. One of them, Jalui village, which I understand means butterfly, but I may be wrong. And especially this one was a very important because it is the site of ancestral sacred sites and burial sites, and also contemporary burial sites. So maybe Juan can share a little bit about this direct action and these protections, how it took place, how long it took place, and what were the results. I know you were telling about how many laws were waived, kind of ignored and trashed while this border wall construction was happening. But maybe you can tell us more about how these actions developed and the results of these actions.
Well, we were able to recognize that these places existed here along what is the Eli Jackson Cemetery, which is a state historical park. And we were aware that this was also a freedman cemetery, but some of our people were buried in this cemetery here, so we occupied this land for 1.5 years. And we were there for 1.5 years holding off the CBP until the funding ran out and we couldn't do anything else but just sit there and wait for them to come but we made them go around, and we were able to file a lawsuit against CBP and Homeland Security to where the point that they have to report to us at least every 30 days of where they're going with this route. While they were doing that, they found 16 more villages down from where we were in Peñitas, and those are the lands that my grandfather had told me to go and recover because those were our lands. When he told me that, I thought we had to go find the deed to it, and the deed was that we were from that area. And so as you go up the river, you find a lot of the Carrizo places, and now we just found a mountain that's called Carrizo Mountain over by Sierra Blanca. So, but all of this is still part of letting the CBP realize that they can't just run over our so we won that NACPRA issue where they had to go around and do whatever they had. We want to stop them. We don't need that wall there because even now the state of Texas is trying to put those barriers in the river, and just the other day another young baby died that got caught into that barbed wire that was there. So this has been our one of our main thoughts. But we know that once they set up that wall, they are already planning to put up pipelines with CO2 that will run upriver to try and get more gentrification out of the area. And of course, they're always attacking the path of less resistance, and that's where we find our problems, is that our people are not that well educated to what's going on there, so they're buying into the system. And the system right now is fossil fuels, and their marketing is atrocious. They lie all the time. They are lying about a lot of things, especially CS2. Those are false solutions, and that's why we're looking at the false solutions, that the government gets involved. And I keep bringing it up at every meeting, and I just want to make sure that it's not about fossil fuels. And they say, well, they have to get a permit from us for anything like that. Right now, there's two pipelines that are waiting to be put in. One of them is the Rio Bravo that will go under that barrier. And don't call it a border wall, because it's not a border wall. It's not at the border. Mm-hmm. So it's going to go under that, and then under the Rio Grande. It's called the Saguaro pipeline, and that's the only time FERC or the Federal Energy Federal Energy Regulatory Commission gets involved in, and they waived a bunch of questions and EIS information that needed to be used to stop one of the LNGs down there. And now we've got a lawsuit against them as well. but we're still in the fight, and we're not going to let anything happen on our lands. And Garcia pasture is right in that area as well. This is all sacred land. This is where people would cross back and forth. There is an inherent right to migrate among the people that lived along this river, and they're being denied that inherent right.
David, do you remember?
Yeah.
When we were, go ahead.
No, sorry, I was thinking that just to contextualize.
So I'm not going to fully play this, but you can Google this yourself. It's a very, if you want to know more about the Carrizo tribe and their fight for all people, not just their own people, but all people down here, up and down the Rio Grande Valley. Feel free to Google it. It's called Land of the Sun and the River of Spirits. And so it's fairly recent. You'll see here episode 13, right? So anyway, so as to close things out here, my hope is, one, I did at least some justice to helping educate you all about what is a land acknowledgement. If you were to ever go to a conference or a place where they were acknowledging, you were like, what's that, right? Now you at least know why we do it. You at least now know two indigenous populations that have historically laid claim to Laredo and listen to their own leaders, their own people. So the Huiltecans, of which the nearest kind of larger area is San Antonio, but goes all the way up to Austin and really encompassed almost all of South Texas because they were migratory, as well then as the Carrizo Comecrudo tribe, which is really right now based out of Brownsville in the southern Rio Grande Valley, but it extended all the way up here to Laredo and Rio Bravo, etc. So hopefully you got some things out of this. This will be the end of today. Thank you all for coming in. Greatly appreciated.